But I always looked at tools as being the place where you start. You take the tool, that's the best piece of equipment, and then you build a process around it. Which is, I mean, it's okay in certain ways. Really, I think it's kind of in the middle. You don't want to wait too long to introduce an accelerant, which is really what a tool should be.
Right.
What you need though is you need to have a defined process conceptually first. So the analogy I would use is like, is it okay to just give a kid a graphing calculator without them knowing how to do the math? Probably not, because they won't be able to tell when the calculator maybe is not giving them what it should be. And you can extend that analogy however you need to. But the idea being like, if we don't, for example, understand like, well, what volume are we talking about? How aggressively outbound are we going? How aggressively inbound do we need to be? Are we doing ABN? Like, are we doing anything? If you don't have that, then spending money willy-nilly on tools is not a great play.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the RevAmp podcast. I am your host, Mark Lerner. I'm joined here today by Malcolm Smith. I had the opportunity to meet Malcolm at an event recently here in the New York City area, and I'm super excited to hear what he has to say. So, Malcolm, why don't you tell the folks at home a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, Mark, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. I listened to a couple episodes and it's fantastic. So excited to be amongst the alum. My name is Malcolm Smith. I am currently the head of global business development for Centrical. Prior to that, I was a business development lead at Databricks. I've been in the SaaS space about 7 years now. I live in upstate New York with my wife and 2 children and just having a great time with it.
Oh, wow. Upstate. So that was a trip for you the other day.
A little bit. Yeah, I used to live across the river in Jersey. But, second kid needed the 4th bedroom. And I don't know if you've seen the prices of 4-bedroom apartments, but they're like, come on. My mortgage is cheaper than that. So
right.
I sacrificed the commute for the space.
Yeah. Just for context for the folks at home, Malcolm and I met at a Modern Sales Pros event in New York City the other night. I actually, we have Pete Gazanji loaded up as a recording for the podcast as well coming up. So, yeah, I got to mine that really rich vein from the event for some really great sales leader insights. And so, one of the things that was covered in that dinner, which I found super fascinating, was just kind of this challenge that leaders have had in sales or in high performing sales organizations, where there's been a bit of like a whiplash where there was free money falling from the sky and budgets were huge and it was tough getting new sales individual contributors or reps into your team because there was so much competition. And then we've kind of whipsawed to the complete other direction, and there's just a lot of the ground beneath us doesn't feel all that stable. And the challenge of having a high performing functioning team that to manage in a sales environment where things are changing and there's a lot of challenges is difficult. And so first I kind of want to get your kind of view on that idea and that challenge, and has it been a challenge for you that you've seen, and what are some of the things that you've seen that have been effective in kind of marshaling people through a difficult time and yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a great topic to consider. I think a lot of the factors you just outlined are absolutely at play. I would say it's probably always a challenge to hire great people and retain top talent, but the economic conditions we're sort of dealing with now make it more pronounced. It is more risky to go to market with lower quality talent. I think in the past you were able to sort of cover things up to some degree just by the size of your team or some other aspects, but now absolutely it does come back to those fundamentals. So I think for me, in my experience, I've made a lot of mistakes. I'll be the first to admit that's probably where I learned most of my lessons. I think when I joined the leadership side of sales dev, I had come from being a really high performing rep myself. And there were some aspects of sort of translating that into a leadership role that I had to sort of learn. So I think like first and foremost, it always comes down to hiring. Like, are you hiring correctly? And that's an easy thing to say, but there's a few things that I think need to be super apparent. Number one, in today's market, I no longer buy into the idea that SDR is a gateway to everything. And maybe the case at one point, but it's just not anymore. And the reality is because it's a tougher market to sell into, the additional incentive outside of your comp is the career progression. And if you're not very motivated to be in a closing role at some point, be an AE, what have you, you're likely not going to enjoy the learning side of the role, right? And that's true in my world. I would say across the board, though, that's the case with everyone, right? If there's no outcome beyond the compensation, I struggle to see where the incentive structure really works. So
Yeah.
when we talk about hiring, right, are you hiring this person because they have potential, or are you hiring them because they actually can execute? And I think those are some of the conversations that I would have a lot previously, where it was like, well, this person doesn't maybe want to be in sales, but they just have so much potential, and we were willing to make an investment there. I think now the reality is we have to look at it through the lens of, well, we're making an investment in you for this role and the next role, and we want it to have some semblance of progression. Because again, without that, I'm not going to get you to do the things necessary now, and how much more difficult it is. I think outside of that also, when we talk about culture, and this is a lesson that I had to learn extensively, what type of leader are you? And if someone is just good, quote unquote, are they going to be good with you? I think there are certain types of leadership that can be adaptable, but there are certain folks that, for like example, myself, I skew way more tactical. I like to get in the mix. I came from that world. I didn't have an operations background. I had a sales background. So there's a lot of aspects to how I manage and how I lead in my vision that certain folks, when they buy into it, it's awesome. I get the most out of them. There are some folks that candidly I don't do as well with. And that's one of the things I'm learning a lot more recently is, am I being honest with myself of, can I be the best leader for this person? I can recognize greatness on another team, potentially. Yeah. It's like, hey, you know what? Our styles are likely going to clash, and I'm not going to get the most out of you. And now I'm more mature and humble enough to suggest I can't actually manage everyone. So again, that kind of goes into the discussion we give salespeople, like the best salespeople disqualify. I disqualify candidates a lot. I'm very much not only looking for high performing reps, just kind of like in an abstract sense, but also like, are they going to mesh with my vision and my system? It's not for everyone. And I think now more than ever, and I was so happy to be joined with so many great enablement folks at that dinner, because it used to be the case that, sales needed to partner really well with marketing. I still think that's absolutely the truth. But now, way more so than ever, we need to be partnering with enablement. The best salespeople have to be experts. I mean, they have to have something valuable to say. And that goes back to the performance culture. If I can't equip you to go to market and having intelligent things and valuable things, compelling things to share with your prospects and potential partners, I'm setting you up to fail. And then that's going to reinforce a negative culture. And that's where people look to escape. So I think, there's a lot there. I'm happy to kind of unpack that.
Yeah.
That's my take kind of off the rip.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, that's I think, very insightful take, and it's one that resonates with me, and I'm sure a lot of people. When we talk about building like a high performing, high functioning sales team, kind of have to define what, function is, high functioning, high performing is to like the baseline, the state, what is dysfunction as compared to functioning. I think that the kind of level that we held high performance up to has probably reverted to a mean, meaning it's gotten higher, but for a long time we were okay with performance that wasn't at the same level because of the things we talked about. But in your mind, what is the like gold standard of a high functioning, high performing sales team, especially kind of in this environment?
Are you asking like from like a performance, like an outcomes perspective?
I guess, I mean, I think that there's the outcome and there's also like the team perspective, right? So, you can have somebody who's performing really well, but if it kind of negatively affects the larger team, it has a kind of net negative effect. So I think, kind of talking about both.
Yeah, no, it's fair. I think you're going to run into that a lot, especially, if you're managing A-type personalities like we tend to do in the sales world.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily look at the end of the day, you have to make decisions that's best for the business. That's the reality, right? If you're a steward of capital, if you have a responsibility of people and responsibility to a number, like ultimately you need to make sure the machine is still running and the ship is still sailing. So when you make decisions, you have to look at it through that lens. Within that, it's hard for me to see a world where I'm going to tolerate a brilliant jerk and that's going to benefit the company. potentially if you're in complete survival mode. But I mean, at that point, you're probably way more forest fires to worry about. But yeah, like if I think if you're getting to the point about culture itself, you can't allow a negative person who's not following process to influence the culture. There are going to be some aspects to people who can operate outside the rules, let's say, and be successful. But that success in a lot of ways is usually myopic and it's looked at through a single lens, like potentially just the results. Yeah. And a lot of times you're not going to be able to measure in real time the impact of these other things that maybe are costing you more than the results do. So I think it's a few things, right? Accountability is a word we get tossed around quite a bit, but it's a real thing, right? Like so much of leadership is just setting the stage for accountability. And what I found for myself, candidly, is that I actually have to spend a lot more time ensuring that I'm holding myself accountable to hold other people accountable. It's very easy for me to drift off into the support role of like, I'm going to look at the problems you're having performing and just try to adopt them on my own and try to solve them with you, which I think is proactively correct. But generally, we need to start from a place of, do I even know why you're doing this? Like, how am I going to hold you accountable if I don't understand your end state? And then beyond that, I can't have anyone be larger than the program. So that like, I can't allow a situation where someone is going to not follow process, not follow the rules, and then that influences the team to think, well, I can do that as well. I think that's how you hold the standard. And a lot of that is just leading by example. If I say I'm going to do something, I need to do it. Because if I show that it's okay to do that, that's what's going to happen. It's small things too, right? Like I hear this from a lot of senior leadership. You know, I don't know why BDRs don't turn their cameras on. I bet you their leader doesn't, right? Like it's small things like that. Like we talk about showing up prepared for a one-on-one. I have to make a point myself to do that, right? Like I shouldn't just show up and wing that with a rep because I wouldn't want them doing that with me. And I certainly don't want them doing that with their counterparts in sales, right? The AEs example. So it's a lot of leading by example and understanding, like when we're talking about accountability, what are we holding people to and why? And like, what is that X factor that's really making you want to do that? Like it is enormously hard to convince someone to do something that is not in their own interest. So you have to figure out, well, how am I going to blend these two worlds together? Now, ostensibly, if they've agreed to work, et cetera, there's an implicit contract there, but even more, you know, there's a daily reinforcement of accountability and understanding. I think you just need to make sure that you're level setting with. So, I mean, hopefully that answered your question, but I think going back to the initial part, it's you can't just look at results. It's a big factor. You do have to look at those leading indicators and following process. But at the end of the day, right, like sales is virtually, or I guess we are in virtue of the fact that it is very much a results-oriented role. We can't allow someone to perform and cost the company money or risk market share, whatever. And what that's suggesting is, hey, you might not be a bad person. I mean, you're never a bad person, right? It's business. But this might be a bad fit for you as a role. That's okay. Maybe there's other things that we can look at. But yeah, realistically, like you got to be hitting your number, but the way you get there, that has to be good as well.
Right. And so you mentioned this word process a lot in, your description there. So I think that's a good thread to pull on. What level of kind of top down or structured process is, kind of the best or your ideal state? So there's, there are people that have a very, very, prescriptive process that you have to A, B, C, it has to fill in this field exactly at this time. And then there are others that maybe are a little bit more laissez-faire, as long as kind of the broadly speaking, you go through these checkpoints. Where, in your style, what is the kind of happy medium?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think a lot of it is going to depend on the maturity curve your org is at. The things that are acceptable in a Series A or pre-seed is going to be way different than a Series D or I post IPO. I think the larger you are, the more you have to rely on process because you can't scale yourself infinitely. So in those types of organizations, especially if you're accountable to Wall Street or public investors, you've got to be really tight. You can't miss things, right? And process, realistically, is just de-risking the probability of outcomes. Like the more thorough your process, the more likely the things are going to happen the way you want them to. And that's important for certain orgs. For other places, that might not be the priority, right? It could be growth at all costs, which was the case for many orgs for many years. I think there's a few levels, right? It also depends on your own risk profile for control. I actually am okay with delegating to some extent and not having complete control over everything. Another word I would introduce is expectation, right? I mean, I have a process for sure, but I also have expectations. And I think when process gets in the way of expectations, in my view, go with what your gut tells you as far as what the commander's intent is. Like if I give you an instruction and you look and say, you know what, the way you're telling me to do this and the way I think I need to do it are different, do what you think is going to work within the confines of what is accepted, what is expected and what is allowed.
Yeah.
I tell reps a lot, hey, like there's a line, walk right up to it, just don't cross it. And so in my world, it's going to come down to things like this, right? Certain orgs are going to say, hey, you can never ever hit somebody on a personal cell phone. Just can't allow it, right? Or you might have some orgs that are very GDR compliant, they're global, like we got to be really careful about where lists, et cetera, come from. Some places maybe not, right? I am okay with folks doing more creative outreach tactics to some degree. I've heard of some crazy stories of people like sending 99 cents on Venmo to get in front of people. There are some orgs that would say, absolutely not. You can never do that, right? So you have to know where that line is. And then, like, what is my expectation?
That's a very interesting. So you
Isn't it
just
wild,
cold
right?
Venmo somebody and they show up on their
Right.
phone, and then you kind of send an email, hey, did you get the 99 cents?
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Sales folks at home. It's a good hack. I like it.
Actually, I think it was they sent 98 cents and they're like, I want your 2 cents or some cute little, you can work on the messaging. But yeah, it was genius. But again, I mean, you have to put that in the context of like, what is the ultimate goal? Like, what am I expecting to happen after I do that? Now, again, if you know your business, and this goes back to hiring correctly, if I know that my target audience is going to appreciate a message like that, go for it. If you're selling into a super regulated space where they're going to be like, look at you, like you got 6 heads if you do something like that, then you should know better, right? And like that kind of ties into the high performance. Like high performance is your mindset correct? Are you analyzing your business correctly? Can I trust you to connect the dots and come to a conclusion that's reasonable?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. It's like, what is the expectation and how well do you interpret and downline what your commander's intent is?
I like that a lot. So shifting the gears a little bit, I think we live in a time where, we were in a mode where every team kind of got their pick of the whatever tools they wanted. The budgets were kind of, whatever you wanted, and that's been pulled back a lot. I think I suffered from this, which is, every problem has a tool solution rather than maybe a process solution. But, to what level is, a high performing team bound by, does technology play in that as opposed to, the other factors of process and strategy and all those things? Is technology kind of high on the list or is it super low on the list?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, or again, I learned by making mistakes early on. I was a geek for tools, right?
Yeah.
I loved, as a matter of fact, a lot of my early knowledge and leadership came from taking demos and just learning about everything. Shout out Kenny Trabler. I don't know where he's at now, but he was at Sales Loft and that guy helped me out a ton. But I always looked at tools as being the place where you start. You take the tool, that's the best piece of equipment, and then you build a process around it, which is, I mean, it's okay in certain ways. Really, I think it's kind of in the middle. You don't want to wait too long to introduce an accelerant, which is really what a tool should be.
Right.
What you need, though, is you need to have a defined process conceptually first. So the analogy I would use is like, is it okay to just give a kid a graphing calculator without them knowing how to do the math? Probably not, because they won't be able to tell when the calculator maybe is not giving them what it should be. And you can extend that analogy however you need to. But the idea being like, if we don't, for example, understand like, well, what volume are we talking about? How aggressively outbound are we going? How aggressively inbound do we need to be? Are we doing ABM? Like, are we doing anything? If you don't have that, then spending money willy-nilly on tools is not a great play. But I don't also think you need to wait too long, because if you get too deep into a process and you haven't adopted a tool, well, now you actually might be costing the company money. You might be misallocating resources and doing things at a place where, if you just had a hammer, you get these nails in the wood a lot faster, kind of thing. So you do need to identify that fairly quickly. So guys, coming back to center, it's like, I would introduce a tool when I've noticed that there is a process that was yielding results, and I'm confident that accelerating or adding to the efficiency of that process would get more results, like more in not a non-linear way. Of course, spend and budget comes into play as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think that I also suffered from the same thing. For me, it was product hunt. I would just go on product hunt and I would like geek out on all these tools. I think that the introduction of AI has is a blessing and a curse. And I wonder if you see it similarly, you
Yeah,
know, because I would imagine in the world in which you operate, these tools could be used well, and they could be used very poorly. I've been on the receiving end of poor use of these tools from, outreach from for as a prospect, I guess,
yeah,
where it's just laziness and like you're not even trying. Um, what are the what are the rules? What are the guardrails that you say, especially when it comes to AI, where everyone has access to ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever to write their cadences, or how do you, where's the rule book or
sure.
yeah,
It's a great kind of microcosm of a lot of discussion because it is very powerful, right? And like everyone can kind of see it. Um, I say it sometimes, not a perfect analogy, but it's like when the internet first came out. Like we can see a lot of value. It's not totally defined yet, but it's there. Um, so many cliches we're gonna roll through right here, but it's the case, right? Like with great power comes great responsibility. You go right, Uncle Ben with it. But look, AI is not going to make a bad rep great. It just won't. Not on its own. It maybe help marginally, but it remains to be seen. I think if you know what you're doing, it's just going to make you better. It all comes back to again, like what is the expectation we have? I would say this: people's expectations of what a good email looks like is infinitely higher now, because now anyone can theoretically write a good email. What I like is when people are thinking about the real problems and understanding, like, well, what are some things we can do now that we couldn't do before? So AI, can it copyright for me? Yeah, it can. That is going to help me to some extent. But if we start analyzing the costs, I bet you it's not really worth the spend. Where it does help potentially is in like role play. If I can start programming an AI to emulate a buyer really effectively, well, now I can train. And what I'm thinking about is like, how much does it cost me to pull AEs out of sales meetings and have them run role plays versus having the bot do it? See, the thing is, the cost of a cold email is not that high anyway, to some extent. Pulling people into meetings, cross-functional work, bringing enablement, making decks. I mean, that's expensive. That's the value add in my mind. So it comes back to like, what are the use cases you're deploying these tools against? And what is your expectation for an outcome? The reality is we have no real tools that do that well. I know I'm going to get hit on LinkedIn and say, no, you're wrong. We have a million tools that do that. And here it is. But okay, fine, hit me. But generally speaking, if I don't have a tool in my tool stack that addresses this problem, it's worth the extra spend. Like I can de-risk some aspect of my go-to-market strategy now. Great. Um, what I would say is this, right? Like you have to dedicate some time as a professional to keeping your skills sharp. Part of that should be experimenting in your lab with AI. Play around with it and see what works. I think a lot of people need to adopt a more experimental mindset when it comes to things. Do a test. You don't have to just buy a tool and roll it out to everybody all at once. Do an A/B test and try to understand, like, I want to prove that X does Y. Now we have some data to work with. We can justify going a little bit further. Again, it's all about just de-risking decision making when it really comes down to it.
yeah. I think
Yeah,
that
so many great things you can do with it, but you just got to prove it out.
yeah, I think that when automation started coming up and making its way into kind of every department, there were probably similar conversations. Well, we'll just automate it, but like if you're not smart about the rules you set for those automations, one wrong decimal and 1,000 people are getting the wrong email or whatever, you know what I mean? And there's, and I don't know about you. I've certainly been responsible for, situations like that early on in my career. There was that thing from, what was it, HBO Max or something, where they had an intern accidentally send an email to like 5 million people. Um, so those risks were there. And so, I wonder if it's all part of the same thing where it's, these are tools that could be used for good and can be used for bad. And how do we incentivize people not to, use them for bad? So I guess that brings me to maybe one of the last things we could cover in terms of high performing teams and how you can be a functional leader in one of those organizations is incentives, right? In my opinion, humans are kind of just the incentives that we have are basically kind of what guide us, right? It's certainly in a sales environment that's even more so. Obviously, ideally everyone wants to be incentivized for the ultimate goal of the company, which is increased revenue, but that differs from organization to organization. How do you find, are the best ways to incentivize? What are the realistic kind of incentives that you can set that push people kind of to go to that next level, whether they're a lower performer and they need to kind of get to an acceptable level, or they're a high performer and you want them to even go even further?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I don't even know if I have all the answers. I think incentive structures go even beyond the business, or I mean, there's like biological realities from an evolutionary perspective around
Sure.
this, right? So it's pretty deep. I've seen it both ways, right? And again, right, I've come from the world as an IC. So I understand the two realities here. Labor is expensive. It's probably the most expensive line item you're going to have on a budget. I am frankly of the opinion that we should be paying people as much as we possibly can. Not only am I going to get more out of you, but I also know, provided some things like financial literacy, what have you, if you don't have to worry about things at home, then I know I can have you focus at things at work. Whenever I have a situation where folks are like, and I've seen this, people consult, whatever, how much should we pay a BDR here? Or how much should we pay an AE here? And I'm like, well, if you try to cut as much out of that as possible, I think you're going to open it up to a lot of issues, right? And you're going to constantly have these remuneration discussions. You're going to constantly have people looking for a little bit more. And then that can get awkward really quickly in my mind. But again, I understand you got to keep your labor costs reasonable. Then there's the variable component. I think a good, simple commission structure is key. If it's too complex, and unfortunately, some products, you're just going to have a complex structure. You got a lot of SKUs, whatever it is. But the simpler you can make it, the better, especially when folks feel like they have an ability to control it. Now, again, going back to hiring, I would hire people that are financially motivated because I think it's just easier, candidly. But if you are the type of person that doesn't want to hire that way, or if your company culture is different and you're not only fixated on that aspect of it, then you have to build a plan that allows for a spectrum of folks to be successful. If it's not just in my TC, maybe it's in that career dev, like we were talking about earlier. But maybe it's more than that. And this is getting into another topic of, before I even think about incentives, I want to understand your underlying why. Why do you even do any of this?
Right.
Yes, conceptually, you got to pay your bills, all that stuff. It's great. But like, remove all that. One of the questions I ask new hires, I get my first one-on-one with them is like, if you could do anything and you didn't have to worry about money, like what would that be and why? I really want to understand like what is making you tick? Like what is your internal value system? And how do I take the comm structure that I have and fit it for you into whatever you're trying to do? And it could be anything, right? You could want to take care of your parents. It's actually a common one. A lot of reps are like, hey, like my parents did so much for me. They were working class growing up. I want to pay off their mortgage. Like, that we can do that. We can build the math there. That adds so much more tangibility. And now the incentive is so much more personal. And we can put it into context. And I think that's so important. But there's a lot of creative ways you can go about it. I think ultimately my main thing though is like, people have to feel like what they're doing is valued and worth their while, especially to go above and beyond. Because if you get someone who's doing the same role for many months, many years, what is their incentive, frankly, to do more? Like it has to be built into that, like either explicitly from a remuneration standpoint or implicitly from the holistic standpoint.
Yeah. And I think I really like that model that you mentioned about kind of getting to the core reason. It's like, let's get beyond the BS and saying, my goal is purely focused on the company, right? Everyone has their own incentives that motivate them. And I love that idea about, helping pay off your parents' mortgage as a way to kind of set the carrot, as it were, to increase productivity and being effective. I actually had this conversation with someone earlier today, and I think it was brought up in the event we went to, but there's these two concepts, like two poles of how people want their employees or their workers, people within their organizations to think about the company. there's the, the model of we're all family, which I've always had a problem kind of fully, accepting. And then there's what one would say kind of the opposite extreme, the Netflix model, where a sports team where you're just as good as your last game or whatever. Um, I would imagine that when you deal with folks in kind of a sales organization, they're a little bit more realistic and, maybe are like me and don't buy into the family thing as much as others might. How do you kind of walk that fine line where it's not like you're expendable, but also like we don't really expect you to believe that we're as important as your parents?
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I'm so much closer to the sports side. I understand where the family thing came from. I think it was candidly my reaction to that is that it of itself was a mindset reaction from the world of like, you are an employee, you are a number, you do not matter, right? I mean, that was like the prior state. So to some degree, maybe it was almost healthy to move away from that and reject it completely and say, no, you're so important, you're part of our family. But when it comes down to it, you can't really get fired from your family, right? I hope not. So we have to be reasonable around that. I think there are certain roles and departments outside of sales, which is extremely performance oriented, where you probably could get away with that. Because what that's suggesting to me is we value you more than just what you do. And you are part of something larger than yourself. And we are going to accept your quirks, flaws, and idiosyncrasies and work with you, which I do think is great, right? I mean, that's the idea of inclusion and diversity and all these different things. Like we are looking for a spectrum of talent and people. We're not going to be biased and exclusionary in any way. I'm totally with that. But the other side of it is when it's a sales role and you need to produce an outcome reliably, consistently. That is where I'm more on the sales team side of like, hey, like if you're not scoring points, you're not going to help us win games, and then you're putting everything at jeopardy. And like, if it's going back to hiring, like if they don't see that and get that, then I probably wouldn't hire them in the first place. But the other important thing, and this is real talk, right? Someone who's very motivated in that world and understands the sports analogy and is okay with it. As a leader, I'm okay that if you want to go play somewhere else and it's better for you, I'll help you get there. Like I have to accept that. I think it would be unfair of me to say, no, I have to keep you here, doing this one thing because you're so good at it. Like spread your wings and fly, baby. Right. And like if that's the role, and it's not here, then that's part of it. And I think that's an important thing. It's like it is business, it's not personal. And I wish you nothing but success in anything you do next. And I'll help you get there if it makes sense. And now I can turn that back into an incentive.
Yeah.
And like where that pops up a lot in my world, people who want to be AEs or SDR managers themselves, those roles, AE roles are more common, definitely. But SDR managers rare. And a lot of places aren't going to hire a rep right into management. They're going to want to know that you at least had some experience closing business. So you might literally have to look external for that. I've gone through that. I've helped people get external roles and effectively leave the company. But that's okay because I was getting the most out of them in exchange. So yeah, I definitely skew more towards the team side. And I think it's important, right? Because all the same analogies sort of work, right? And like you can align everyone around like winning the championship and like what are the pieces we need in order to do that? And everyone plays a role there. So it allows you to celebrate the process and celebrate the incremental success. And, everyone is part of the championship, even the support staff that doesn't take the field. Like we can appreciate everyone, RevOps, we can appreciate enablement because without them, we wouldn't be able to win. I think that works super well. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, Malcolm, I really appreciate your time today.
Sure.
It was super fascinating going on this journey with you. Before we leave, why don't you tell the folks at home where they can maybe learn a little bit more about you, kind of connect with you out there in the socials if you have any?
Yeah, I mean, the best places for me is LinkedIn, just linkedin.com. I think it's in Malcolm J. Smith. I was lucky to snag that early, so there it is. And yeah, I'm actually right now, if I can do a little plug, I am hiring BDRs in New York City, hybrid 1 day a week in office. So if you're curious, you want to see what the future of sales development looks like, I'm evolving it really as we speak. Come be on the cutting edge. I'm excited to work with you.
Malcolm, thank you so much for taking the time today, and I look forward to hearing back from you soon.
Definitely.